In this video, we honor Noah Longworth, who helped this channel with information about a copyright violation. In addition, we honor JWin07 Max, who suggested this video's subject, due to the fact that his Vietnamese grandfather fought alongside the United States Army during the Vietnam War. After the French defeat at the hands of the Communist Viet Minh in 1954, the resulting Geneva Accords divided Vietnam between a Communist North and a Free South along the 17th parallel. Soon after the partition, about 1 million Vietnamese fled the Communist North for the non-Communist South, assisted by the French and the United States navies. This major effort was called Operation Passage to Freedom. The next year, the Southern Republic of Vietnam was established and considered itself a bastion of freedom and anti-communism. Many of the Vietnamese refugees were Catholic, who had been persecuted by the Northern Communist regime. The United States gradually entered the conflict in Indochina, beginning in the early 1950s, giving assistance to the French, and then eventually following on with economic aid and a trickle of military advisors to South Vietnam to counter the later communist incursions from the north. We thought of life in terms of generations and centuries. We saw the French and Americans as temporary, but our family stretched out in front of us and stood solidly behind us. Our longer-term responsibility was not to a nationalistic cause, but to our ancestors and family. The soldiers of this young country were in the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, which was shortened to the acronym ARVN, ARVN. For the sake of clarity, we'll group all South Vietnamese soldiers, whether militia, regular units, or special forces, under the umbrella term ARVN. The key question is, what did the ARVN think of the American soldiers in the Vietnam War? After communist insurgents called the Viet Cong started rising and causing trouble in South Vietnam, the South Vietnamese government reached out to the United States for help in the mid to late 1950s. In 1961, President Kennedy increased the number of American advisors who were embedded with the ARVN patrols. To give an understanding of the scale of the buildup of advisors, in 1962, the United States had approximately 11,000 military advisors in South Vietnam. In 1967, there were 23,000, and by 1970, it was 34,000. Every year, Americans watched more and more advisors head over to Vietnam on the television news. Not all advisors had the same duties and training. Some were there to assist with civil engineering, like building schools and improving infrastructure. Even the military advisors had different levels of training, depending on their roles. Many of them were trained at the Army Special Warfare School at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, which focused on unconventional warfare and counterinsurgency. Some even had additional hands-on jungle warfare training at the Jungle Operations Training Center in Panama. They were given basic Vietnamese language training, but fluency was rare. Advisors usually had a vocabulary limited to key military terms and phrases. Advisors trained the ARVN in counterinsurgency tactics, especially against the Viet Cong, with an emphasis placed on small unit tactics, ambushes, reconnaissance, and defensive measures. The ARVN view of the American advisors was mixed, as one might expect with a sprinkling of them throughout South Vietnam. On one hand, ARVN soldiers valued their advisor's tactical expertise and his equipment. Early on, many U.S. advisors developed sentimental attachment to the Vietnamese, living with them, sharing their food, and imbibing their culture. Advisors trained ARVN soldiers on American-provided gear and educated them on the American way of war. ARVN soldiers had no respect for advisors who didn't have enough rank, for their meddling, or their misunderstanding of Vietnam's unique terrain. They felt that some of their military advisors were overbearing, even though they heavily relied on them. Over time, after witnessing their advisors fighting alongside them in the field, many shared a bond that could only be formed in combat. The following shows how much the ARVN appreciated their advisor. During the Battle of An Lok in 1972, the ARVN, supported by U.S. advisors and air power, faced an intense assault by North Vietnamese forces. One ARVN officer revealed what happened. The enemy's artillery pounded us endlessly. I was leading my men to hold a key position when we found ourselves pinned down. Suddenly, a U.S. advisor with our unit crawled to my side. Despite the danger, he called in air support with precision. American jets roared above us, striking the enemy lines. He stayed in the trenches with us, encouraging my men and sharing our rations. His courage inspired us all to hold our ground until reinforcements arrived. American advisors stayed with the ARVN, even during the massive buildup and the later drawdown of U.S. forces. The last U.S. advisors left on March 29, 1973, following the signing of the Paris Peace Accords.
The determination of all Americans to carry out our full commitment to the people and to the government of South Vietnam will be redoubled by this outrage.
After U.S. President Lyndon Johnson received congressional approval for action in the form of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in 1964, which was based on inaccurate and purposefully skewed intelligence reports of North Vietnamese ships engaging a U.S. vessel a second time, and never actually happened at all, he was able to more directly intervene in South Vietnam. This direct intervention, like Korea before and every war the United States has had since, came in the form of hundreds of thousands of combat troops arriving to fight the communists, without any declaration of war, in open defiance of the United States Constitution's wise directive. From March 1965 to 66, 385,000 American soldiers were stationed and fighting in Vietnam. Every year, ARVN soldiers watched more and more arrive to assist them fighting the communists. ARVN soldiers didn't call the war the Vietnam War, they called it the American War. The Vietnamese people had lived under war and oppression for a very long time, long before the Americans had first arrived. There was a whole generation of ARVN soldiers who grew up learning about the atrocities committed by the French, when Vietnam was a colony of France. Eventually, many ARVN soldiers would start seeing American soldiers as a substitute for the French who were long gone. The war was fought almost entirely in the South Vietnamese countryside, adding to the villagers' stress. We gave up our sons and then had our villages destroyed by our allies. It was a nightmare that never seemed to end. One young Vietnamese teenager had a difficult life growing up, but he had fond memories of the first American troops he encountered. These blue-eyed, blonde-haired GIs in their cool uniform appeared attractive and good-looking. A young South Vietnamese draftee soon came to the realization that his government wasn't prepared to train him. Although Americans assisted with some of the training manuals, there was confusion and disorganization waiting for him at his training station. He was forced to sleep on a hard floor for the first 3 nights. When given an American manual, he found it incomprehensible and couldn't follow along with the instructor. I had trouble figuring out where we were at any given time. Part of the problem may have been that some English military terms were adopted into the Vietnamese military lexicon in order to cooperate with their new ally and his new way of making war. The new draftees described the awful feeling in the barracks each night, when they knew they weren't learning enough to defeat the communists. What was missing from the new training programs was the notion of what our ideological program was. Anti-communism just seemed too reactive to us. We needed something that we stood for, not just notions of what we were against. Strangely, when the Americans first arrived, the average age of the regular ARVN soldier was 29, which was 10 years older than the average age of the American soldier at 19. Also, the typical ARVN soldier had 7 more years of military experience than their average American Allied soldier. The reason for this was due to Vietnam's history of drafting soldiers on a seasonal basis, after the rice crop harvests were finished. However, as the years progressed into the late 1960s, this ARVN military experience was mostly washed away, as new draftees filled the South Vietnamese army. ARVN soldiers felt that they were neglected and their training was poor overall, especially compared to their American counterparts. To compound this problem, ARVN soldiers had to learn how to use foreign American equipment. More will be said about this in a little while. Emphasis was given to U.S. combat missions over ARVN training. The American military presence provoked anger and resentment. Vietnamese naturally resented the way the Americans looked down on them and imposed American methods on a presumably inferior people. They were angered by American impatience. They want everything done yesterday, not tomorrow. The Americans were forward-looking, optimistic, and impatient, whereas the Vietnamese were closely tied to their past, resigned, cautious, and infinitely patient. The Americans had a blind faith in technology. ARVN soldiers clung to age-old superstitions. On one occasion, when a U.S. advisor proposed using tear gas to clear out an enemy stronghold, his Vietnamese counterpart protested that it was the windy season, and if the wind blew the tear gas away, the attack would fail. The American insisted that this was no problem. There was plenty more gas, and the attack could be resumed when the wind died down. But if the wind blows the gas away, everyone in the area will believe that God is on the side of the communists. ARVN soldiers found American culture incomprehensible and knew little more about American history other than some cliches about the Marshall Plan and anti-communism. We went to war side by side, puzzled by each other, a country of yesterday and a country of tomorrow, each trying to keep in step with the other. Although many ARVN appreciated American generosity, they were also bewildered by the opulence and waste. Sometimes they found amusement in the curious ways of their allies. A common ARVN joke was that the Americans were going to cement over the entire country and then win the war because there would be no people left. They complained that American soldiers acted despicably toward them, tearing up roads and endangering the lives of civilians by deliberately recklessly handling vehicles and firearms. An ARVN major protested that Americans trusted only those Vietnamese who accepted without question their way of doing things and doled out their aid in the same way as that given to beggars. Most of all, the South Vietnamese resented their growing dependence on the United States and its increasing visibility in every facet of their lives. They wondered how South Vietnam could maintain its identity if the Americans dominated everything from the economy to the manner of waging war. ARVN soldiers envied the high life of the Americans, with their air-conditioned bars and clubs, the PXs where Vietnamese were not permitted to shop. The result was a strange mix of feelings. Many ARVN came to consider the U.S. occupation a demoralizing scourge, even theorizing that if we can only get rid of the Americans, then we could worry about the Viet Cong. Although many ARVN knew that the Americans were not colonialists like the French, there was a certain demeaning air about them that they felt some must be just as bad. These culture clashes were made worse by the inflation that the Americans brought to the small South Vietnamese economy, with their wads of cash and demand for expensive imported goods. By 1969, an ARVN private salary was half as much as a common laborer. Common household items went up almost 5 times in price, while soldier salaries were stagnant. Americans introduced a system that made us buy what we used to grow ourselves. Our soldiers' pay could never keep up with the rising costs of imported goods. South Korean troops were given substantial offensive missions, but the ARVN were reduced to a security force. We hated that the Americans gave the South Koreans such significance in our country. They went on offensive missions alone from an early date, while we sat and waited for our orders. That we then imported our food from them convinced me and most of my friends that the Americans would never view us as a legitimate nation. Another ARVN soldier stated, "How could the U.S. bring South Korean troops to our country and unleash them? How could the U.S. then make us eat their food? What sense does any of this make? Is that any way to build a nation or care for its soldiers?" It also didn't help anything that South Korean soldiers, like the Americans, left thousands of little babies in their wake. Whether the relations were forced or not, many ARVN soldiers resented that Americans brought these foreign troops into their country. The ARVN had mixed feelings about American-provided equipment. They were grateful that the United States gave them the military gear, but sometimes there were problems. For example, the M16 was lighter than other rifles, and it had a high rate of fire and good accuracy, but it was more complicated than the earlier, simpler rifles. The earlier versions of the M16 tended to jam during a firefight and didn't do too well in the muddy and humid environment of Vietnam's jungles. Over time, as the M16's design was improved and ARVN soldiers received better training on its maintenance, opinions of the rifle generally improved. It didn't help that the Soviet-designed AK-47 used by the enemy was more reliable and better suited for the environment. But there were other opinions on this matter. One ARVN lieutenant colonel noted that the introduction of modern weaponry, such as the M16 rifle, significantly boosted the morale and combat effectiveness of ARVN troops. He observed that these weapons provided a substantial advantage in engagements with enemy forces. ARVN soldiers loved the M113 armored personnel carrier, which was an American hand-me-down. In many ways, it was perfect for the war in Vietnam. It was tracked and like a mini tank for ARVN soldiers. They used it to break through heavy jungle to attack and overrun enemy positions. They would mount an M60 and/or a 50 caliber machine gun on it and patrol through the villages. While the Americans were still in country, ARVN soldiers liked the UH-1 Huey helicopter and the mobility that it provided. However, there were two problems. Helicopters went against the Vietnamese way of war. Number two, after the Americans left, they couldn't be repaired and maintained due to a lack of spare parts and training, the way the Americans had done, so they were used less and less after 1973. ARVN soldiers enjoyed the fact that American soldiers could call in accurate and timely fire support, whether artillery or fighter aircraft. Seeing that their American allies were wasteful of ammunition, they started doing the same thing. ARVN soldiers were encouraged to call upon U.S. forces for fire and air support and for backup when they encountered difficulties. This became a real problem later on in the war, when the American support became a trickle of what it had been, but the habit was still there. U.S. and South Vietnamese forces frequently surprised each other with military initiatives. The lack of coordination hindered the ability of each to respond to enemy attacks and occasionally resulted in the accidental shelling of friendly forces. South Vietnamese officers would also later claim that the relegation of their units to security duties eroded their combat effectiveness and left them ill-prepared to fight the big unit war that would soon be forced upon them. Most ARVN soldiers didn't normally serve side by side with U.S. troops, although there were some exceptions. U.S. commanders wanted to fight in their own area of operations and had the ARVN serve as rear area security forces against Viet Cong and communist sympathizers. At times, less than a dozen reserve battalions were allowed to participate in mobile offensive operations with U.S. ground units. Some U.S. commanders outright refused to go out with ARVN units, but only buckled when threatened by higher-ups. The Viet Cong had infiltrated the ARVN, and therefore many were left out of American briefings. Cooperation between Americans and the ARVN was closest at the lowest levels, especially among combat soldiers, and worst at the middle levels. There was also the problem of cooperation of medical care for the wounded. If World War II would be the ideal example, then if a U.S. soldier came across a British or French wounded soldier, then they would receive the same exact medical care as any American soldier, being put in the same medical tent. There would be no distinction. However, that's not what happened in Vietnam. On paper, there would be the same care, with the ARVN having their own medical evac helicopters and trucks. However, the reality was that the ARVN wouldn't always come in a timely manner, or even arrive at all. One U.S. soldier recounted that there are two systems of medical care, one for the Americans and another for the Vietnamese. He called in a U.S. medical evac for a wounded ARVN soldier and got in trouble for it. Medical evacuation for ARVN soldiers was often slower and less organized. Helicopters were not as readily available for ARVN units, and ground transportation was more commonly used, which delayed treatment and cost ARVN lives. There were, however, some notable exceptions with high amounts of cooperation. An ARVN paratrooper shared a story about a joint mission to extract a downed U.S. helicopter crew near Quang Chi in 1968. We received an urgent call for help. An American helicopter had been shot down in a dense jungle area under enemy control. My unit was tasked with rescuing them. As we advanced, we came under heavy fire. A group of U.S. soldiers joined us, providing covering fire and guiding us with their maps and radios. When we reached the crash site, the U.S. pilot and crew were wounded but alive. Together we formed a defensive perimeter and fought off multiple enemy waves until helicopters arrived to extract us. During that mission, language barriers didn't matter. We were united by the shared goal of bringing everyone home safely. The Tet Offensive compelled closer cooperation between the United States and South Vietnam. The prospect of defeat galvanized the South Vietnamese into action as nothing had done before, and made them more receptive to U.S. advice. It concentrated their minds wonderfully. The United States paid for ARVN equipment and many things, even down to the mosquito spray that the regular ARVN soldiers used. Many ARVN soldiers saw their country's authority gone, along with the corruption of government officials and poor resources. The American presence was so powerful and pervasive that many Vietnamese frequently referred to the U.S. ambassador as the Governor General. The Communist North broadcasted on Radio Hanoi that the Republic of Vietnam was a puppet government and told how American wolves were tearing apart their beloved land, and there were some elements of truth to it. This had to affect ARVN morale and make them ponder whether they were fighting on the right side or not. South Vietnamese officers had reservations about U.S. strategy, but in general said nothing. We depended so heavily on the Americans for almost everything that it was difficult to get our opinions taken into account. ARVN soldiers operated within a system where openly criticizing the actions of U.S. forces or the war effort could have been dangerous or politically inadvisable. Some ARVN officers may have felt compelled to remain silent or downplay their feelings for fear of retribution or alienating their allies. When I first joined the Army in 1962, I did so because I was patriotic. I loved my new country of South Vietnam and hated the communists. Over time, however, I had a hard time explaining the political nature of my country. So many leadership changes in Saigon and dependence on the Americans made it impossible for me to talk about the nation. By the latter half of the war, with some exceptions, every South Vietnamese male aged 16 to 50 was legally required to serve in the military in some capacity. This put a lot of strain on rice farmer families, who had few males to do the harsh seasonal planting and harvesting. There were some young Vietnamese men who were inspired by the American soldiers they saw. When you got up close to them, aside from that full war gear they were wearing, I found nice human beings, generous, kind, and sweet. They were no different than our people in their thoughts and feelings. Once in a while we approached some soldiers that may have been a little more cautious. Then they could be cranky. Another Vietnamese civilian seemed inspired when recounting that he had seen Rangers bravely fighting. The Rangers yelled for the people to move away, or they'll be killed in their firefight. It's uncertain whether he meant U.S. or ARVN Rangers, but from the context it appears that he meant U.S. Rangers. There were other times when American soldiers shared their rations with their ARVN brothers at arms. If it weren't for the kindness of our American friends, the enlisted men, we would have been in a terrible fix. ARVN officers and leadership didn't trust the Americans fully, and, as stated before, they were intentionally left out of combat briefings at different levels. Part of the reason was because the Viet Cong had infiltrated the ARVN, and partially because of the lack of American respect for ARVN fighting abilities. At some point after 1965, some ARVN soldiers started living in a fantasy land, deciding that this was America's fight, not theirs. It's very much like a big brother who takes over in a fight and then the little brother decides to hold back and watch him beat up the other guy. If the Americans are going to make all the decisions, what kind of country will we be left with? The end result was that ARVN soldiers were relegated to rear area security and pacification duties, and the Americans and other allies, like the Koreans and Australians, were given offensive missions. Many officers and men found the pacification mission demeaning and assumed it without enthusiasm. They were quite content to sit back and let the United States run the war. One ARVN soldier was overheard saying, "Why should we fight? The Americans are doing the fighting for us. It didn't help that the South Vietnamese government didn't project an idealized image of what the regular ARVN soldier was fighting for. Up until the end of 1967, American generals had been telling the American press and public that victory in South Vietnam was just around the corner, possibly within a few months, or maybe next year. That's not how the North Vietnamese government saw the situation. The old military saying is, the enemy gets a vote. North Vietnamese General Vo Nguyen Giap was profoundly influenced by the principles of guerrilla warfare and military strategy, which share similarities with Chinese General Sun Tzu's philosophy in his book called The Art of War. Giap meticulously studied the strengths and weaknesses of the Americans, tailoring his strategies to exploit their vulnerabilities. He demonstrated his adaptability by shifting between guerrilla tactics and conventional warfare, depending on the situation at hand. Know thy enemy and know thyself, and you will win 100 battles. All warfare is based on deception. The Tet Offensive began on January 30, 1968, during the Vietnamese Lunar New Year holiday Tet, which was traditionally a time of truce and celebration. Many ARVN soldiers were on leave at this time. The North Vietnamese Army, also called the NVA or People's Army of Vietnam, broke this truce and surprised the Allies by sending over 80,000 NVA and Viet Cong troops to attack more than 100 cities, towns, and military bases across South Vietnam. It was like the NVA was putting in all of its chips on one hand of poker. General Giap wanted to show the reach of the NVA and Viet Cong by hitting the high-profile U.S. Embassy in the southern capital of Saigon. The reality is that the Viet Cong was militarily devastated and almost wiped out in these attacks. ARVN soldiers rose to the challenge and helped American soldiers overcome most of them. It was a massive, chaotic situation, but the Allies slowly but surely overcame the Communists. However, to the news reporters and the public back home in America, this was an unbelievable shock. New protests erupted. Journalists who were previously in favor of the war suddenly turned against it. Giap's strategy did partially work, but not in the way he had expected. He believed that the South Vietnamese people would rise against their American oppressors and their puppet government. Although that didn't happen, the damage was significant in the American public's mind, and it would last. On March 16, 1968, after the Tet Offensive had been beaten back, American soldiers were sent on a search and destroy mission based on faulty intelligence evidence that a hamlet near the demilitarized zone called My Lai was a Viet Cong stronghold. They faced no armed resistance, but that didn't stop them from ravishing the women, burning the hooches, and mutilating and slaughtering somewhere between 347 to 504 unarmed civilians, old men, women, and children, and their livestock. No weapon caches were found. This was all covered up with false Army reports and only came to light a year later, after a brave former soldier and an American news reporter exposed the massacre. Horrible actions like these did nothing to help the strained relations with ARVN soldiers. Even if everyone in the hamlet were die-hard Viet Cong communist supporters, but they were unarmed and not resisting, these horrible actions wouldn't have been justified. Whatever happened to rounding up people for questioning and imprisonment? Imagine if this had happened only 23 years earlier in Germany, while the Allies were advancing into the heart of the Third Reich. If there were suddenly intelligence reports that a certain German hamlet was full of Nazis, but no armed soldiers, would the U.S. Army have gone in and wiped out every single living thing? This had to have caused ARVN soldiers to be shocked at American actions and caused a problem. The very people that the Republic of Vietnam was trying to protect were being destroyed by their ally, and North Vietnamese propaganda about American colonial masters started to ring true and harder to counter. And My Lai wasn't a single event. There were many undocumented and unphotographed cases of destruction of South Vietnamese villages, people, and livestock by American soldiers. ARVN soldiers often found themselves in a complicated relationship with their American allies, relying on them for support while resenting their conduct and cultural insensitivity. The Vietnam War was already brutal enough, and ARVN soldiers were under immense pressure while facing the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army. They didn't need anything like this from their allies. We lived through French imperialism, war against the fascists, a liberation war with the French, and never had we known such problems. After U.S. President Richard Nixon came into office, eventually a thought occurred to the politicians in Washington, D.C. Why not let the ARVN take over their war again? They called it Vietnamization. To the average American soldier, it appeared that the ARVN soldiers weren't taking full responsibility for their own war. ARVN soldiers were angry at this suggestion, because they had been fighting the Northern Communists for years before the first Americans arrived, and this term made it seem like they were just starting to fight. Even after 1965, they had sacrificed and suffered the most. The American hope was that the reluctant ARVN soldiers would start seeing their ally gradually pull back, realize that he had to fight, and then fight as vigorously as his northern cousins. The Tet Offensive in 1968 had shown that the ARVN could really fight well when pushed up against the wall. The ARVN lost about 5,000 men killed during the Tet Offensive, in contrast to about 45,000 for the other side. ARVN soldiers had the courage and ability to hold off an enemy force 10 times larger, which was proven later in the war. Vietnamization, to some ARVN soldiers, meant that they could now fight the communists on their own terms, and that those pesky U.S. advisors who had been pushing an American-style war would go away. It was finally time to do things the Vietnamese way. Others felt that it was also a good time to get rid of reliance on American firepower. I thought that the problem in Vietnam had been the Americans and their war plan. I applauded the news that we would be able to take over more and more offensive military operations. After all, what good is a national army if it cannot determine its own fate and that of the country it is trying to defend? Vietnamization came too late and was imposed too abruptly. ARVN officers complained that they had to cover more territory with fewer troops, and they worried what would happen when the Americans, who were still pressing the buttons and calling the shots in combined operations, leave Vietnam. A mild-mannered ARVN soldier, once staunchly pro-American, protested, "You created an economic Frankenstein monster here by making this a big war, and now you're telling us that we have to learn almost overnight to be austere and take care of ourselves." The ARVN had been given full latitude to fight on its own only when the communists were at their strongest, and the Americans would no longer stay the course. We came into our own only when the Americans were leaving, and the world was ready to forget about the fate of South Vietnam. Gradually, the Americans left Vietnam. Shortly after the Paris Peace Accords in 1973, South Vietnamese army commanders were initially elated. Some even wanted to invade North Vietnam. However, many ARVN units with once illustrious battle records had lost much of their fighting spirit. The people and soldiers were tired of the war, and the combat didn't seem to have an end in sight. You gave us your weapons and you tried to teach us your military ways. But did you really expect that we would fight the war as you did? If you did, you haven't learned very much about me and my countrymen. As the supplies started to run low, and complex equipment like Huey helicopters broke down, then some of the earlier advantages ARVN soldiers had started to decrease. The NVA smelled blood after the Paris Peace Accords and, in contravention to them, started to go in for the kill. Slowly but surely, the communists were grinding down the ARVN and winning. Supplies from America dropped sharply, and that is why we lost the war. That's my opinion. From the point of view of logistics, the South Vietnamese army was equipped with Second World War weapons that were not as sophisticated as the weapons that the NVA used. Many of us believed that the U.S. was simply giving up, that Washington had set us on this course and was now abandoning us in our hour of greatest need. To the South Vietnamese, of course, the Paris agreements represented the worst form of betrayal. The United States had callously used South Vietnam for its own purposes, then treacherously cut a deal with its mortal enemy without consulting them. When the Americans wanted to enter, we had no choice, and now, when they are ready to leave, we have no choice. Exhausted, demoralized, and continually defeated, ARVN troops struggled to find meaning in the war. For many, anti-communism was still enough of a reason to continue fighting. For most, the lack of a viable government in Saigon meant that a free and independent South Vietnam was a dream that simply would never come true. Compounding that depressing reality was the feeling among many ARVN regulars that the officer corps was corrupt, and that the government had mistreated its soldiers. This is not to say that South Vietnamese President Thieu himself was corrupt. However, many of his inner circle and many officials at different levels of government certainly were. Perhaps this complicated subject will be discussed in another video, but for now we'll move on. One ARVN infantryman asked rhetorically, "How can we put faith in a government that treated its citizens and military so badly? They mishandled every aspect of the war." The situation later got so bad that troops in the field had to pay for their artillery shells to corrupt government officials. Not only that, but ARVN officers withheld their units' pay for themselves, and men just ran away. ARVN soldiers felt that South Vietnam was forgotten by the rest of the free world. There was a delusion that when things got really bad, that the Americans would come back. In fact, Nixon had written that promise down in a memo to the Republic of Vietnam's president. Of course, because the U.S. Congress turned its back on South Vietnam, President Nixon would have a problem sending bombers or troops, even if he weren't embroiled in a scandal like Watergate. Imagine that, a person like Nixon breaking his written word. What was the world coming to? And, as the NVA fearfully looked to the skies, no bombers showed up. This was the moment when the communists realized that they could break the Geneva Accords with impunity. They had played the Americans like a fiddle. You have replaced your promise with a piece of paper. For many ARVN soldiers, the retreat by their American allies was a source of frustration, anger, and despair. What did they have to show for years of sacrifice in the fight for their nation's survival? That's what our American friends did. They left us, and we couldn't recover from it. Our troops felt that the United States betrayed Vietnam, not the American GIs or the American people, but the U.S. government and politicians. The war lasted so long, and there were so many U.S. troops killed and wounded. America spent billions on the war, and after a while the U.S. government said, "Enough." Ultimately, however, inflation compounded by a loss of morale, poor government leadership, and American cuts to military aid eventually led to the fall of Saigon. But the capitulation took years to happen, which says a lot. If the ARVN were as incapable and inept as depicted in popular culture, they wouldn't have been able to hold off the communist forces for as long as they did. Even in the April 1975 chaotic evacuation from Saigon, the ARVN could still draw upon the resources of its soon-to-be former ally. U.S. helicopters brought thousands of South Vietnamese to American ships offshore. Here is a detailed breakdown of the estimated casualties of the Vietnam War from 1955 to 1975 for all sides. After the fall of Saigon, former ARVN officers were told to report for re-education. They were asked to bring enough food for 10 days, but many were imprisoned for years and even decades. Veterans tell horrible stories about forced labor, malnutrition, and the loss of their friends in the bamboo gulag. When finally released years later, many were harassed by the authorities and eventually fled overseas. Like their American allies, former ARVN soldiers suffered from the memories and horrors too. Long after the war, one former ARVN soldier would never speak ill of the Americans or the communists. Hun Phan fled his native land after the North Vietnamese prevailed. He came to America alone with just 16 cents in his pocket. But he persevered, married, had children, and brought many of his family members over to the United States. There were some programs to assist Vietnamese refugees, also called the Boat People. One was called the Orderly Departure Program, an effort to reunite refugee families. Some ARVN veterans have said that they would like to sit down with their former U.S. allies and talk about the war, but language is a barrier for many, so they find comfort around each other. For all their differences, many U.S. and Vietnamese veterans are bound by having passed through the same crucible. Here is a memorial service for South Vietnamese President Thieu, with different nationalities represented. The caption reads, "The memorial service for late Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu was organized by the Northern California Association of Former Political Prisoners." Why did we lose? all the Vietnamese and U.S. soldiers who died in the war. What did they die for? What did we fight for?